everybody. Welcome to another episode of Ancient Mysteries Unearthed. I'm your host, Chris Noble. Today, we have a really special guest, a phenomenal musician and sound healer. His name is Stephen Halpern. You've probably heard of Stephen Halpern if you've dabbled at all into the sound healing realm of life. But if you're not familiar with Stephen, Stephen is a Grammy nominated multi platinum recording artist and one of the original pioneers of sound healing and therapeutic music. Absolutely one of the OGs in this area. So, of course, as you know, I love this stuff. This is going to be a really fascinating episode. But a little bit more about Stephen. So, for nearly 5 decades, Stephen has explored how tone, frequency, and resonance affect consciousness, drawing from both modern science and ancient wisdom traditions that understood sound as a tool for healing and awakening, as we talk about a lot on the show here. So, through extensive research into brainwaves and human energy fields and many, many other avenues, his work has helped bridge ancient vibrational knowledge with contemporary science, neuroscience, and things of that nature. Now, as a composer and an author and an educator, Stephen's legacy has profoundly shaped meditation practices, holistic medicine, and the global understanding of sound as medicine. So I'm sure you can all imagine how excited I am to talk to Stephen today. So Stephen, welcome to Ancient Mysteries Unearthed. How are you today?
Hi, Chris. I'm good, and what a beautiful introduction. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I think you added some things to what I probably sent you, and that was great.
Well, we like to spice it up a little bit here. I'm sure as someone like yourself, you get your bio read a lot, over and over. So we try to make it a little more interesting. Myself as a musician, I know when we're on stage and at a festival and someone's reading out your bio, it starts to just become this thing over and over. I always like when people spice it up. So for yourself, Stephen, we're going to get into a lot of really fascinating topics today, but I love to start off the show with the origin stories. So how did you, I know you're a very accomplished musician and you didn't start off this way. So what shifted for you? What was that moment where you started to see that music's not just entertainment? There's something a lot more sophisticated and profound going on. What was that like for you?
Well, music has always been fundamental to my existence, and sound. I've always been very sensitive to sound. My hearing is beyond what most people hear, which has astounded some of the audiologists that have tested me. But when I first got into music was through the public school system. They gave out, instruments in fourth grade and third grade, and I chose trumpet because it looked simple. But trumpet became my early vehicle to experience not just the language of music, but starting to study about how chords and melody and notes fit together. Coming up through jazz improvisation was still learning the rules. What's really started waking me up on multiple levels was an experience in 1965, my first year at the University of Buffalo, when I was invited out of the audience to sit in with a jazz band playing music like John Coltrane and McCoy Tyner. And as I joined them in that high energy vortex, I started playing some of the scales and riffs that were impressive. In other words, things I had practiced and that always went over well and showed that I knew what I was doing. But then all of a sudden, I was caught up in the energy and the music started playing itself. My trumpet started playing itself, and I was not in control. Literally, the trumpet was weightless on my lips, and I knew something was different, but I didn't know exactly what until I was finished. And my friend said, "When did you get so good? You didn't play that yesterday." Well, it was in the presence of these other high energy musicians that I tapped into another level of where the music is and having the music play through me. One of those musicians was a professor named Jack Clark, who was a local guru figure, poet, researcher, mythologist, etc. And I became one of his star students and experienced an awakening through that, and then would be studying the ancient origins of music. From the first time I heard about Edgar Cayce talking about ancient healing temples in Egypt, and of course in Greece, where the musicians and artists, etc., would work to connect with their muse. So early on, from my freshman year on, that became part of my intention setting. If this is how the ancient artists did it, I'd like to. It'd be great. Wouldn't it be great if I could connect with my muse? I didn't think that could happen, but I set that intention. And over the years, there would be a couple other experiences. But I'm playing in the jazz, rock, idiom. I'm playing trumpet. I'm playing guitar. Had some situations where on stage and whatever, uh, me vanished and just music was being played through me. I became the instrument of the instrument. What I understand now is that that prepared my nervous system, in a sense, to be ready to hear and then to play a new form of music that came through on keyboard, much less energetic than playing trumpet, where you have to be fully aware of your diaphragm support and you have to use your breath. You could just sit quietly at a piano as I do, and move my fingers a little bit, stay in a meditation state. But how that all happened was during a spontaneous meditation in a redwood grove outside of Santa Cruz, where I was taken by some wonderful hippies when I was hitching from San Francisco to the University of Santa Cruz to see the William Blake exhibit, and was mistaken for a guy who had applied for a staff position at this sister organization of Esalen Institute, the Human Potential Institute. And when I showed up, instead of the other guy, he says, "Oh, well, are you looking for a job?" I said, "No, but if you're offering, I'll take it." "Well, then come back in a couple hours, meet the staff. You could hang out down the road." So I just walked down the road, found the meditation area, and then was deep into a spontaneous meditation in which I started hearing a different kind of music than I ever heard before. And I also heard essentially what became my mission, that this is the music that you've been praying for, to connect with your muse, that this would be the healing music for the 20th century that no one else was doing. People were playing yoga music, things that had been done, but no one was playing something new and composing something new. Now, this music doesn't work on trumpet. So I go, after the meditation was over, I walk back to the Bridge Mountain Foundation, and I go to the wrong building. There's a piano. I sit down, go into trance, and start playing this beautiful music that I'm not even hearing because I'm in an altered state, natural, no artificial plant medicines, etc. And about 10 minutes later, I hear somebody cough. I look around. The staff had walked in. They were all meditating and lying down and doing yoga, and say, "Who are you? Where did you learn to play like that?" Well, that became the my intro to something is happening. What is going on? How did I learn to play like that? And very quickly, I started getting answers from psychics, and also showing when I wound up never going back to the University of Buffalo, I started to experience things where I would be shown things. And one of these happened in a used record store where Rosemary Brown's album, A Musical Seance, was there in the classical music section, which I never would go into because I was trying to replace my jazz and jazz rock record collection. And she talks about how some of the famous classical composers who are dead are still alive in another dimension and are channeling music through her. Sometimes they dictate, and then just like I explained to these other people, they move my fingers and I don't even hear the music, but the music is being played. And I remember almost falling down in the used record store saying, "Wow, that was what's happening to me." And that's when I started taking this seriously. Well, where I'm now hired became the weekend retreat and weekend workshop center for many of the leaders of the human potential movement. One of them was Dr. John Lilly, who's famous for his research with dolphins and then ketamine and other consciousness expanding drugs and the isolation tank. He heard the music and said, "Wonderful, but if this is really something special, you need to do research." And I'm going, "I'm a musician. I don't know how to do research." Left it at that. 3 weeks later, Dr. Stanley Krippner is doing a weekend workshop. Says the same thing. If you want to be taken seriously, you need to do biofeedback research for objective data, not just people saying, "This is the most relaxing music we've ever heard. I feel so healed." And I'm going, I don't know how to do statistics. I'm not scientifically trained. I have no access to biofeedback equipment. And he says, if you sign up for this new program that he is the co-director of, we have the best biofeedback equipment in Northern California. As a student, you could use it for free. We will give you free students to use as research subjects, because you're part of the graduate program. And I started working in my dissertation about a new contemporary psychology of music, but it's still very left brain. And working with the professors that I had to answer to, it was kept pretty much left brain. But a requirement for the degree was that I did indeed conduct the biofeedback research. And they Dr. Krippner hooked me up with some wonderful graduate students and scientists who had developed one of the first two aura video and aura photograph devices called Kirlian photography in the United States. So in addition to using brainwave analysis and GSR analysis for biofeedback, we used aura photography. And the results were so dramatically different than the most relaxing classical music, which is what I was comparing my new music to, that one of the research associates said, "This is no longer just your research program. This is your life. You need to tell the world about this new music." And I'm going, great. How do I do that? I know nothing about business, nothing about marketing. As an independent, I can't even record my own album because there were no studios that would let you record unless you were signed to a label. So that was 1973, but that was the week in March that began my second half of my life, where suddenly I'm dealing with music that produces effects that are different than what any other music that they had tested and that we had tested was available. And then 2 years later, the first studio available to independent artists in the San Francisco Bay Area opened. Met him at a Christmas party. I was in his studio January 4th, 1975, and recorded my first album that weekend. I didn't know that you're not supposed to record a whole album in a weekend. I had been playing my version of the Chakra Suite already in meditation groups and private concerts, and everybody said, "Where can I get an album?" And it became clear that my job was not just to play the music in concerts or private meditations, but to record it and get it out to the world. And that was the beginning of learning a whole new set of skills, making a lot of mistakes. Nobody had done this before. There had never been an independent New Age meditation label that was taking the music nationally. And a lot of mistakes were made. Now, since we had very low budget, they said, "How do you make an album?" "Well, you need something for the cover. And you could buy a cover for $500 or $1,000. And I said, "Why don't we use a Kirlian photograph of the leaf that was part of the research?" So I said, "Fine, we'll do that." Turned out this was a ridiculous choice of a cover because people didn't understand it. They thought I had done it for plants and not people. They said, "Well, this is psychedelic lettering, and I'll take responsibility for choosing that font with the artist." But very quickly, stores, interestingly, if you turn this album this way, they said this is actually a pornographic album. It's an obscene cover because it looks like female genitalia. So very quickly, I had to change to another cover, which was for Spectrum Suite, where again, we're looking at the tones of the 7 major tones of the scale, with the 7 major colors and the 7 chakras that all correlate. And this was a system that I didn't invent, but had been around for hundreds of years. I'm the first person that really put a soundtrack together with it and marketed it. And just because chakras, these etheric energy centers, resonate to sound and color, when you listen to the music, your chakras would resonate and come into their perfect pattern of resonance. And when I would do live presentations, I would also show slides of the colors. And some of these are up on my website, on my YouTube channel, and people could experience some of that. But in concert, in workshops, at conferences, this was part of how I presented the most important part of the early teachings, which was that when you balance and tune the chakras, wonderful things happen to your consciousness. And over the years, fairly soon after that, because of that research, I became the leading musician, the only musician to be invited to science and consciousness conferences, where I would present and learn many other things about brainwave entrainment and access to a whole other level of information. That when I would talk about, Chris, when I would talk about brainwave entrainment early on, people said, brainwaves? What are they? Do I have one? Said a woman to me early on. Chakras? When I'm on a radio or TV show in 1975 or 76, the host would say, chocolate? What flavor? Milk chocolate? Dark chocolate? No, chakras. That was before yoga went mainstream and people didn't understand what they were. Well, one of the other research associates that I connected with because of the people that I hired to do the research was Itzhak Bentov, the legendary scientist and inventor who wrote the book Stalking the Wild Pendulum. And when he experienced the chakra suite music, he said, we need to take this nationally, because when you align the chakras, it creates a situation where the music, the blood supply going out of the heart up into the brain, instead of being random like it usually is, becomes a tuned oscillating system, and it pulses the brain in a way that the brain likes to be pulsed, and it sets up your brain waves naturally shift into an 8 cycle per second deep alpha state. And in that state, according to Bentov's early research, which is why his book was so extraordinary, you resonate and entrain to the dominant electromagnetic frequency of the planet, which, not surprisingly, is 8 cycles per second. It's known as a Schumann resonance, 7.8 to 7.83 to 8 cycles per second. That's what the atmosphere vibrates at. That's what the earth vibrates at. And that became part of the reason that people felt so good when they listened. Without knowing it, their bodies would naturally shift into a higher order of coherence. Not only that, but not just their bodies and the blood supply pulsing up into the brain, but the fact that your brain waves and your left and right hemisphere operate usually differently. Let me give you an example. If I sing a very familiar pattern of ascending notes, which most people will recognize as a scale, watch what happens at the end. So I will sing the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. And how many of you are hearing that final note in your head before I sang it? Do. How many of you were holding your breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the final note? We are so culturally conditioned to anticipate where the music is going that, number one, we're always out of balance and always leaning kind of towards the future rather than in the mindful state of being here now, as Ram Dass was teaching us. Being here now. But what happens when we're analyzing that scale pattern, that predictable pattern of music, because all the music that we've heard has predictable patterns. Our left brain is more active. Our left brain is analyzing and predicting. Well, that's the big factor, and the right brain is not doing much. What my music does is synchronize and balance both hemispheres and shift the brain into a higher order of coherence. So I first started learning that in 1973 when I was in London in 1977 for the first Body, Mind, and Spirit Festival. The leading brainwave biofeedback scientists, Dr. Maxwell Cade and Dr. And his associates, Jeffrey Blundell, invited me to their lab. They checked out my music. They put the electrodes on my head, and they said, we must have done something wrong because we've only seen this level of coherence with the leading British psychic healer, Rose Gladden, and a 75-year-old Tibetan monk. How could you be doing this? We'll have to reset. And they put the electrodes back on. And when the same results happened, they looked at me and said, who are you and how do you do that? And I go, I don't know. I'm just doing what I do. And that was part of the change, and realize that this is not just a figment of my imagination. I have world-class scientists telling me that something different is going on when I am in the state to replay and record the music. And more importantly, when people are listening to the music, they go into that state. It doesn't hit you over the head like heavy metal rock or something, but very gently, as Bentoff would write, if you were to ask the body, how would you like to be resonated and entrained? Would you like to be hit over the head with heavy drums and big rhythms, or would you like to be caressed into a higher order of coherence? Well, certainly my body wants to be caressed. And happily, over the years, millions of people have wanted music that helps them feel more like themselves. People say it feels like home. I feel like myself when I'm listening to this music. And that was how the shift happened. All the problems about launching an independent record company, licensing in 1985 to a major label, getting ripped off, going back as an independent. A lot of the same stories that many musicians have gone through. But because I was an independent artist, I had more control about what I wanted to say on the album jackets. And again, I'm always trying to speak about healing the individual, healing the planet, and music to balance the individual, music to balance the planet, correlating colors and sounds in the chakras. The title became the Spectrum Suite because I'm coming up through the spectrum of colors and the 7 tones of the major octave and the 7 chakras. But it wasn't until I found an artist that could create the image like this that is now on my chakra suite and chakra balancing albums, where you could see the 7 colors going up to 7 chakras from the base of the spine to the crown chakra, over a bed of the Sri Yantra. You asked how I also first got into this. I first saw the Sri Yantra in a mandala book that Carl Jung had written, and I was fascinated by it. And reading the description, this was a cymatic image of sand sprinkled on a resonating disc into which the scientists had chanted Om. And the Om created a series of interlacing triangles as a function of the diminishing harmonics. And I said, wow, sound can do that? So I was pretty much the first American to start talking about cymatics, working with the work of Dr. Hans Jenny and then Dr. Peter Manners, and brought this information back to America, brought it into my imagery on the albums, in my workshops, in my writings, and started educating my audience and a lot of people, and through the media, the fact that sound has effects much more than just making your heart beat match the speed of the music. This is, entrainment, but the entrainment of the heartbeat is not as subtle as the entrainment of the brain waves. This became my mission to spread this information, and not just as a scientist, but as a musician, to spread the resources and the tools that could help people experience that. So it was left brain, whole body, balancing the aura. And that's how I got into it. And I've been doing that ever since.
Thank you, Stephen. Wow.
A long
It's
answer, but there it is.
but it's a necessary answer, I think, because there's just so much to your story, and I loved it, and I appreciate that. I know everyone watching and listening, it's really amazing because now it is mainstream in a lot of ways. It's so common, which I'm grateful for, that it's finally become the mainstream. I was laughing when you're talking about how people used to think the chakra system was chocolate system, and so that just shows obviously how much of an evolution we've gone through. Now, before we get into some more of the fascinating science that you've been able to uncover here, and there's just so much because I love to nerd out on that as well. I would love to still talk about your connection to the ancient past and these ancient modalities that not only have influenced your work and your research, but I would love for you to talk to me as well about the experiments that you've done at some ancient sites, like my favorite, the Great Pyramid. So, how has that influenced your work, Stephen?
One of the first experiences I had with what I learned later on was past life recall and awakening some past life memories was sneaking out into my high school auditorium when the band wasn't there, playing my trumpet, playing a long note, and hearing and feeling deep reverb for the first time without all the notes of everybody else cluttering the space. When I heard the reverb and echo inside the Great Pyramid, I flashed back to that early experience, and it was part of my cellular memory experiencing sound in sacred spaces like the Great Pyramid, like some of the underground temples in Malta and around the world. And now there's research on resonance about standing waves in Stonehenge and so many of the other sacred temples. Well, when we got inside, got permission and found out who to pay the bakshish to in 1980 and 81. In 1980, it was part of part of a tour with Pat Flanagan and some other people, but there were 8 people in the King's Chamber at the same time. Our bodies absorbed a lot of the reverb, and I said, if I ever get a chance to come back, I want to record inside the pyramid by myself. And the next year, they were doing the tour again. They invited me, and I was mentioning this to my studio engineer, and he says, "Egypt, I'll be your recording. I'll carry the recording equipment. Take me. Just I'll work for free. Just pay my plane fare." And that was how we got inside the pyramid. I had met some of the people that you had to grease the palms because that's how things typically were working back in 1980 and 81. And we got some time to be alone inside the Great Pyramid. And when they would turn off the lights and it was totally dark, it was fantastic. I started hearing things, but there was nobody around to be making any sounds. Then I started doing some ohms and chanting to see which tones would resonate the walls of the King's Chamber. I also start my initiation CD by striking the corner of the King's sarcophagus with my fist, and you will hear that sound on the recording. That's a boom, and tuned my voice to that, which turned out to be an A438 hertz frequency, not even a 432, at least not for us. But when we also took that sound and I connected with let's see, blocking his name for a second, the American who developed his own cymatic devices, the images that came from my voice inside the Great Pyramid were different than what Carl Jung and those cymatic images were. And he said, my gosh, I've never seen anything like that. So there were mysteries that showed that the pyramid energies were alive and changes depending on who's inside, who's chanting, etc. So that was an amazing bit of research. And the album, of course, has no basic words, so it didn't make sense to sell it in most stores. I sold it through my direct mail order company, and many people forgot about it because it came out on cassette, so there was always tape hiss. But when digital technology allowed us to remove the tape hiss, I put it out on CD in 2005, and when I've presented at pyramid conferences like Global Pyramid in Chicago, and they're having another conference in the fall, the 300 people in the room, about 220 of whom had been in Egypt, all had out-of-body experiences. They were back in Egypt. They had past life experiences. It's the best recording made inside the Great Pyramid because we had studio quality portable recording equipment, a great engineer, and I also record pyramid silence, so that in 1980, when the album came out first, people said there's something the matter with this tape. There's music missing for 10 minutes on side 2. And I said, no, it's not missing. That's the silence. You're supposed to meditate. Put your headphones on, close your eyes, and you'll feel like you're inside the pyramid because we're using PZF pressure-sensitive microphones. Well, that was part of the research. And now with streaming and online, a lot of my early albums that were tapping into my own past life experiences where music would play through me, not always and just in the meditative modality, but in some more trance-inducing aspects, like on my album Here to Eternity, which features Moroccan flute and some trance drumming from Morocco, which was one of the things that I was studying. I was accepted and developed a graduate program that I was going to pursue at the University of Buffalo, studying ethnomusicology and sound healing from indigenous cultures around the world, varieties of musical, meditative healing experiences. But instead of just studying it, I got to experience it, and that was what I started bringing out. But all that music was basically rhythm-based, because when you have a strong hypnotic rhythm, your brainwaves and your heartbeat will change and you go into trance. I mean, that's what people have been doing for thousands of years around the campfire in the caves of Spain and early cavemen. We know they were beating on skins and logs and things to make sound, and obviously not playing fancy drum beats. But when you play certain rhythms, as is known with Michael Harner and trance induction, that's the easiest way to get people into altered states through sound. The rise of disco and EDM and rave music is a contemporary example of that. But even rock music, starting when rock really got loud in 1968 and 69 with Hendrix and Cream, people like William S. Burroughs, the beat poet and writer, who had gone to Morocco to do research and to get into trance with the master musicians of Jajuka and the pipes of Pan, that Brian Jones also got into. He said, this is a contemporary manifestation of the ancient use of sound, and now we're doing it in football stadiums for 30, 40, 50,000 people at a time. So this is like a revival of that early use of sound. Of course, many people had altered their consciousness with drugs as well, but the volume of the sound itself could do that, and the repetitive rhythms would do that. And my early studies in undergraduate in the sociology of music and the psychology of music, I understood the history and the purpose and the function of music was not just for entertainment, was not just for intellectual stimulation, not just for emotional release, but could take us into higher levels of consciousness. And as the field of brainwave entrainment has continued to percolate out, and people understand more about why brainwaves are important, and with, and unfortunately, it's much more. Well, fortunately and unfortunately, it's much more prevalent on YouTube. There's a lot of websites and YouTube videos that are out there that are, shall we say, not well done, and that I find completely unlistenable because it's very easy to do a bad entrainment album. How for me, how I tell if I hear or click on a video and I hear bub 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 bub. Yes, that kind of sound will entrain your heartbeat and train your brain, but it gives me a stomach ache. And many people find it is like audio X-lax. So maybe there's a subset of the population that's constipated, and for them, that kind of sound works as entrainment or resonance. But I'm interested in higher functions and higher coherence, and the healing and meditative aspects of that. And that's how the research has continued. And as I get feedback from other people and at conferences where 1,000 or 2,000 people in the audience at once are going into the same brainwave state when I'm playing the music or live or on recordings. Years later, when I met Rupert Sheldrake, the brilliant scientist who wrote the new nature well, talked about how biology works and how our bodies shift when one person's brain shifts into higher levels of balance and entrainment. It radiates those frequencies out into the world and makes it easier for other people, whether in the room or out in the world, not close to this person, for them to shift gears. He calls this morphic resonance. And that is, I believe, a very powerful aspect of what can happen, the potential for healing and coherence, that I would bet most of the streaming websites and platforms did not intend for some of their music that they're streaming, like Chakra Suite, which I've experienced differently when I hear it coming back from Pandora or Spotify than when it's played just in the room for myself, because so many people are simultaneously shifting into higher levels of consciousness without realizing it, because it doesn't hit you over the head. It doesn't, get you so spaced out. It's subtle, but it's real. And that's that's part of the ongoing research that I've been part of, and writing now more about the aspect of beyond just brainwave entrainment, but getting into brainwave synchronization. And when you synchronize and balance both hemispheres of the brain, you create a higher meditation experience. It helps individuals tap into their own innate intelligence. They're able to reprogram their own DNA, as scientists like and medical experts like Dr. Deepak Chopra and Bruce Lipton talk about. You can, in the higher coherent states of meditation, that is the most effective and productive state to be in if you want to instruct your genes, your DNA, to express for healing and higher consciousness. Now, that still is not known by a lot of people, but Chopra and Lipton have been talking about this for years. They are two of the leaders. And when I first met Bruce, somewhere around 2002 or something, Bruce Lipton, and I said, well, how do you instruct your brain and your genes to express for higher consciousness? And I remember he looked at me and kind of smiled and says, you could talk to them in English. You could just set the intention with your mind. I said, how could it be that simple? He said, I don't know how, but it is. And are you concerned about how or the fact that it works? And I'm a practical guy. I said, I want something that works. And that's been the basis of still being in business after 50 years. My music has worked for millions of people to help them get into a state, whether they could identify and name it or not, but where they feel more like themselves, where they feel at one with the earth, at one with the world, and with the universe, because some of these frequencies, as the ancient yogis and mystics knew, when you tune into the Om frequency, that is a sound that even modern astrophysicists say, and quantum physicists, is the sound of hydrogen atoms, many levels raised, but that's their resonant frequency. So you are now vibrationally able to resonate and train with higher dimensional frequencies. So whether you're interested in meditation, contacting angels, your spirit guides, your own higher intelligence, your higher power, whatever the names that you feel most comfortable in using, sound and music can be a vehicle to get you there. But if the music is so interesting that you're paying attention to the music and go, oh, I know where the music is going, la, 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 I love this melody, that takes you out of the meditation state. And that was something that I learned early on. So when I'm in the studio composing, I'm not thinking. In fact, sometimes I don't even hear the music until playback, when I go back with the engineer into the control room out of the studio where I'm recording on the keyboard, and I go, wow, I don't remember playing that. And for me, that's one of the most fascinating things, again, because I came up as a very left-brain musician. We were trained in the jazz vernacular to know every note of some famous solos, to be identify which musician is playing, and to really understand the theory. So to suddenly not be in that space at all was phenomenal. And it was also great a relief, because it took some of the responsibility off my shoulders. And I realized early on from some of the other experiences that I've had that I work with other composers. Over the years, I've had people come and say, well, in fact, one of the albums that I came out with in the early 90s called Higher Ground has an album that began, in fact, with one of the videographers from the Egypt trip in 1980 who said, I remember me? Yes, you were married at the time. Of course, I remember that. And she says, well, now I am a channel for the Pleiadians, and they have a message for you. And I go, well, what? She said, well, they want to do another recording with you. And I go, what do you mean another recording? How do I know, what you're saying is for real? We'll send you a photograph of where you were in the Redwoods when you heard the music in 1969. And this is before I was talking publicly about that. It's before I showed anybody a picture. They sent me a photograph, and I said, whoa, okay, I'll talk with you. And we did an interesting session where, again, music would come through that I realized that what I play is not always just me, but I work with a band of angels, a band of co-composers. You'll find many of my albums, I thank my co-composers. I don't name them because I was told that would, take people's attention away from the beauty and the healing powers of the music itself. So in my memoir, I will share some more of those stories, but it's also been part of my own quest to find out who I'm working with, how this happens. When I met, again, through the initial research, Dr. J.J. Hurtak, he was the first to say, you are channeling and working with higher dimensional frequencies, higher dimensional beings. I said, but I don't see them. They don't talk to me. I don't know who they are. I said, it doesn't matter. In fact, some of them said, we don't give you names because we don't want you to get hung up on the name. We don't want other people to get hung up on the name. Have the experience. Be in the moment. And that's been my guiding star ever since. And to this day, when I'm working on albums, I will listen at night as I'm falling asleep. I will listen in a meditation state. And many times I will hear additional levels of music in my head. I will hear, you need to change these notes and bring this in. And I'm given instructions, which I remember. And the next time I'm in the studio, I tell the engineer, we need to move this phrase over here and take this over there. And he says, how do you know how to do that? He says, I heard it. And he knows not to question that anymore. And he said, well, you can't do that. I said, I already heard it on the inner planes, so I know it can be done. That's what the music tells me it wants to be. Just like authors and writers often say the characters in their books or plays speak to them and give them dialogue. The music speaks to me, but not verbally, but I would hear and then I follow, because my job is to be the instrument of the instrument of the music to bring it through, and that's been the way I've worked since day one, and continue to do so.
I love it, Stephen. This has been really affirming for me too. Your process is similar to mine, and when I'm writing, especially the meditation music, it's just I don't know what's happening. I'm meditating in the process, and I play piano like to do that because piano is the lightest in that
Right,
way to stay meditative. And I grew up playing trumpet as well. I only did 2 years. I had braces at the time, and it was just not a good situation.
right,
But I remember that I love that instrument, but it's physical and it would take you out of that meditation state. So I completely understand that.
right.
But it's just wild what kind of trance states we can go into, and then what people do call channeling comes through. I never spoke to other beings or had visions like all these other channelers do, but every other channeler I've talked to, when they see me doing my music, like I'm sure when they see you with your music, they're like, well, you're channeling too. Obviously you're just going through an instrument, and the music is the language, but of course music's a universal language. So
Right.
I just love that. My next question for you is, looking back on your incredible, illustrious career, and you've done so much amazing research, and we've really just scratched the surface of all the stuff. Of course, we can't in just one episode, but for our lovely audience, got to check out Stephen's memoir that will be coming out, where there's going to be a lot of
Soon.
that great information. Looking back at all your research, what have you found are some of the most interesting aspects that have come through? As an example, so in my research, I'm Canadian. I live up here in Vancouver, and much like yourself, traveling the world all the time. But there's a Canadian university here, University of Toronto, that did some research on 40 hertz about 7, 8 years ago. And the 40 hertz therapy was really good for Alzheimer's, dementia, and at least halting and stopping the deterioration of neurological disorders. So I incorporated that into my music, and have since had really incredible responses from people on the 40 hertz side of things. I'm really curious on your end, what have you come across outside of binaural beats, of course, brain entrainment? Are there certain frequencies you've come across that have really had a profound impact on you? What's jumped out to you that you've really been pretty surprised about from your
Well,
career?
of course, when I started seriously researching the effect and the difference between alpha and theta, I made basically a 5-minute recording. And since I own the rights, I added the entrainment of the alpha frequencies 12, 11, 10, 9, 8, and meditated with those, and then did another series in theta, 7, 6, 5, 4. And they all sounded the same because of the entrainment. I don't have it loud, like bop, 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 bop. So it's very subtle. It's built into the drone, so I mask it. So it's comfortable and artistically done. But when, up until that point, I would add the entrainment after I had done the recording. So in other words, I went in naked, as it were, and had my own brain waves, but then added brain entrainment afterwards, where I could dial in what I wanted. In 2011, that was the first time I started playing with headphones and the entrainment in my head as I'm playing. And particularly when I got down to 8 cycles and the Schumann resonance, and then moved down from 7 to 6 to 5, that was still fine. I was enjoying myself. When I got to 4 hertz, the deepest theta, I suddenly heard the music in my head before I played it. And that was fascinating. And I looked at my engineer and said, I'm staying in 4 hertz for the rest of today and for a lot of the rest of my career, because that was, at least for me, a frequency that got me into my highest clearest meditation state where the music flowed more freely. So that was interesting, and continues to be so. On Ancient Aliens, the TV series, they talk about not just 40 hertz, and that's fascinating because I don't know how you put the frequencies in, but that's just, I would assume, more like brrr. You can't really hear the beats per se, and maybe we'll talk about it off air so you don't give away your secrets. But there was also in the temples, in the underground temples in Malta, where they did resonance research, they said there's 110 hertz frequency that would be activated by the male voices, but the female priests couldn't activate it. So that's why they focused on the male priests at that point. But when you double the frequencies of 110, which they said this is the frequency that they would use for channeling and for healing, you get 220, and you double that, it's 440. And everybody is saying 440 is a deadly frequency. Well, maybe not so deadly, because that was in the healing temple in Malta, the hyperbarium. But whereas 432, we know, has a biological basis. And early on, I was one of the first people to start talking about that. But I was also pointing out that if you play bad music at 432 hertz, it is not better than good music played at 440 hertz. So even some of the rules about 440 being anti-healing, again, when you look at some of the ancient structures, not necessarily so. When you chant, I don't know, when you were in Egypt chanting in the other two big pyramids, there was very little resonance and reverberation. The king's chamber was better than the queen's chamber. When I got to the temple of Isis on the island of Philae, there was basically not any reverb because it's outside, but the birds, when I started chanting, would all come around, and I had some of the worst tourista, Pharaoh's Revenge, that morning. Could barely get out of bed. I lay down on the on a platform at the Temple of Isis. The birds came, they sang. I was able to get up, do the recording, play the flute until a bunch of soldiers came by and stopped the recording with guns pointed at me and my engineer. And we were on our way to jail until my engineer said, "General, put these headphones on. Listen to what we just have done." And we got unarrested, and we're able to get back on the tour and continue with our life. But a lot of magic went on. There's so many secrets in Egypt and so many other places around the world that it's always fascinating to tune into that. And the fact that we could recreate some of that in the studio has been a wonderful boon. And with even decent headphones, you could create that audio space. Many people now, of course, listen to music just as aural wallpaper. That's AURAL as background. They're not paying attention. They hear, but they don't listen, or they listen, but they don't really hear. They don't pay attention. Early on, I learned to be paying attention and meditating with the music and going into the space. Here's another key aspect: the space between the notes. With a lot of my music, the critics hated it. He said, well, he leaves so much empty space between his phrases. Well, if you listen carefully, you will hear that my music sustains with the reverb and the echo. So it's not pure silence, but that's where I hear into the quantum field and I play as I tune into that field. But most people are so jacked up and conditioned to playing with a strict beat. As a musician, most musicians, as I was, are taught to play with a strict beat and are unable to break free of that training. For whatever reasons, I was able to break free of that. I could still do that. I've played conga drums with bands back in San Francisco and Buffalo, and I've been on stage with Ola Tunji and some great African drummers that I studied African music. My rhythm sense was great, but the new music leaves all that aside, and I go into that space. One other key phrase I would mention is that because of the state that I get into, and you might have experienced this also, it's not just the notes that we play that people experience, but it's our own state of consciousness, it's our own vibratory reality. What I learned from the first Science and Consciousness conference I was invited to in 1976, Dr. William Teller, a brilliant scientist, said that he talked about every atom, molecule, cell, and gland has a characteristic frequency at which it vibrates. Anything that vibrates radiates frequencies out into the world at that frequency, but also responds and resonates to frequency at that same frequency rate. So that's why when I play the basic frequency of a chakra, it'll work for everybody's chakra. Now, some people's chakras are sharp or flat or out of tune, but this music, the chakra suite, will help it get back in tune. And the other part of that consciousness is that music is a carrier wave for consciousness. And this ties in with physics and quantum physics. In other words, when I am in a meditative state and playing music, the same notes played by somebody else who's copying me, and I've heard examples of this, so I've proved it in my own life, you could play the notes, but if your consciousness is not elevated and in that space, the notes have no spirit. The notes don't produce the same effect as the whole field of consciousness with the tones and the music. The consciousness rides on the music, and our brains and our bodies, our auras, our energetic, electromagnetic energy field resonates with that. And that is part of the magic of music, certainly part of the magic of my music and why it continues to work, because these things are, no matter whether you're male, female, old, young, whatever nationality, whatever race, seem to be true. If you're a chakra, you're going to be vibrating at a particular frequency if you're in a human body. And your brainwaves are not random. If you're in an alpha state, your alpha state that tunes into the fundamental frequency of the planet is going to be about 8 cycles per second. As I mentioned before, and let me just circle back around to that. When you get into the balanced state, whether it's through tuning the chakras or through listening to an album like Deep Alpha or Deep Theta, that sets up, because your brain is now pulsing and vibrating at 8 cycles per second, that sets up an associated electromagnetic field around the skull, around your head, that then resonates and entrains to the dominant electromagnetic field of the planet itself. This is physics. This is not, and it's also metaphysics, but it's not woo-woo. But I've been thrown off of some TV and radio shows for even mentioning that. And then other ones say, come back and tell us more about that. You mean it happens automatically? Yes, if you're alive, it happens automatically. This is a function of being human. All life forms on Earth, other scientists have said, resonate to the basic Schumann resonance, about 8 cycles per second. Well, we're a life form. It's not surprising that that is fundamental to our being. And, if we build that into the music, we can make it more healing, more beneficial. And if we bring in some of these other factors, and again, that's why I learned early on, musician, heal thyself, musician, tune thyself. Before I record, in the early days, I would take an entire album. I'd tell the engineer, take an hour off. I need to meditate, because in a great studio with the complete silence of an anechoic chamber with this completely soundproofed, I would have great meditations. And then when I start to play, I'm in that zone. And they say, we don't understand what he does. We love to have an hour off where we don't have to do any work, and he pays us for that. But then when he starts playing, he doesn't make mistakes. How does he do that? Well, I became a little bit of a legend at the Music Annex. We don't know what he's doing, but it sure works for him. So we let him do it. We're happy to take, an hour off, and then I got it down to a half hour and 5 minutes, and then I'm able to do it within a minute. And when I recorded with Paul Horn in 1984, we went into that state together and we started playing, and sometimes we heard the same music. Paul Horn, the great flute player, whose early album Inside the Taj Mahal was one of the first great new age albums, was never supposed to even be released. But again, the reverb and echo in that album, when I first heard that, took me right there. And that was before our albums Inside the Great Pyramid. Some of the only places you could really experience the beauty of one note hanging in the air with a reverberation of many seconds and just focus on the pure tone. Doesn't have to go anywhere, doesn't have to do fancy scales or fancy compositions. It's pure tone. And that's why people love crystal bowls or the Tibetan singing bowls. Not a lot of melody, not a lot of variety, but as Alan Watts taught, when you listen to a Tibetan bowl, which might be wah, 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 some of the reverb, or a crystal bowl when it's singing, there's no melody, there's no structure, it's pure tone. And many people go into an automatic meditation state because the tone shifts their consciousness without them even being aware of it. And they say, oh, I like that, whereas other people don't, and they resist and don't want to go into that state and say, oh, the crystal bowls give me a headache, or that, I'm bored listening to a Tibetan bowl. And there was a time when I was one of those people. Okay, the bowl, I've listened for a minute, what's next? And one of those times was in a lecture by Alan Watts in 1972 in our graduate auditorium. And he was able to see me and said, some people in this room apparently do not know how to listen to a Japanese temple bowl. Listen to and he looked right at me. So I was busted. And in my head, I'm going, okay, Alan Watts, you're great, but, do something else. What's up? No, you focus on the furthest away sound. And I bring that into my recordings. And that's where the space between the notes is so important. The gap and the space between songs on a CD, I would time to the rhythm of a deep breath. You lose that with streaming music because one song follows another, and sometimes one song cuts off the song before, so it doesn't even end. And in concerts, in orchestras, people often begin to clap before the final notes of a composition of an orchestra piece die away. They're clapping and they break the mood. And for me, it always was so painful. It was like a punch in the gut. Just let the music fade out and then you could clap, but just dwell in that vibratory beauty and that bath of pure vibration for a little longer. And a lot of people don't want to go there. Or they want to say, hey, I want to be part of the performance, so I'll be the first person to begin to clap. So there's an entire psychiatric workup of that Dr. John Diamond wrote about back in the 1970s and 80s. And we were saying some of the same things, but he was a psychiatrist and a doctor, so people believed him more than me. And me, back in the 70s, I was like, you're a little strange. Why don't you clap? Well, because I'm still with the music. There's plenty of time to clap. I want to be uplifted by the beauty of this classical piece. So that's a listening lesson for today.
I love that, Stephen. And I'm glad you touched on the 440 hertz music. There's a lot of the conspiracies out there with why it's bad for us, quote unquote. And I actually tuned my music to 432 hertz because for me, I do notice that it affects, and I've done a lot of A/B testing just in my own workshops and concerts. And like every time the 432 tuning of the exact same thing seems to have a more, let's say, relaxing, like compassionate sort of vibration.
It's a little warmer. Now,
Yeah.
did you tune you have a acoustic piano or electric piano?
Well, electric for practicality.
Right, because you could tune that. When I talked to my piano tuner, early on, I said, uh, I when I came back from Egypt, I tuned my Yamaha C3 grand piano, which is great, to 438 from the period. But of course, that
Right.
doesn't really, that's just a little bit. I said, I'd like to tune it to 432. He says, well, you'll have to see me once every 3 months for 3 years, because if you do it right away, the instrument will explode and it'll destroy, and we can't do it. You have to take it down in stages. I said, well, we'll keep it where it is. And, that's it. But electronically, easy to do. I
Yeah.
haven't noticed a huge difference in my own creative process for composing differently in 432 as opposed to 440. I'm able to work in both.
Yeah.
But what I noticed, because at first I was listening to a piece in 440, and then I listened to like Chakra Street at 432, and one track right after another. And I have a couple of videos on my YouTube channel where you can listen to examples. The problem is like drinking wine, but it's more difficult. You don't have a palate cleanser to listen to. Whatever you listen to first sounds right. Whatever you listen to next sounds wrong. So what I started doing is I would listen to the 440 version for a week, take a couple of days off, and listen to the 432 version. And then it sounded perfect. My engineer at first said, well, it sounds duller. I said, well, no, it sounds warmer. And then he got it. And then we're fine in, working with that. But that was how I recommend listening to music on a steady diet of that. And like if you're working on that, that's the way to proceed. And then in the field, there was a guy named Brian T. Collins. Have you ever run into that name?
No.
He was in, I believe, the Vancouver area, or my friends in Vancouver turned me on to him. And just a shout out to Canada, Simon Fraser University was up around there. And then, of course, Dr. Murray Schafer wrote a book called The Tuning of the World, which I was turned on to in 1976 at the huge conference in Vancouver, the World Symposium on Humanity, which was legendary. Scientists, people don't know him, but he invented the word soundscapes that I would in turn bring into the music industry that nobody knows. Everybody uses it. I was the first album to talk about ambient soundscapes, and the reference The Tuning of the World was Dr. Schafer's book. But the more that this information gets out there and people experience it, the better. And
100%.
And then there's other people that say, well, 528, music should be tuned to 528. You've probably heard that also. And when Len Horowitz and I met some of the scientists who were first working with that, and I said, well, when you say tuning, if orchestras traditionally tune the A note to 440 hertz, and we're talking about tuning the A note to 432, what note are you tuning in the system of 528? And these people would look at me like, you're from Mars. We don't know. I said, well, find out.
Pretty important question.
Right. Because if you're saying 528 is the most healing frequency, and that doesn't relate to any note in the traditional tuning frame of Western instruments, what note are you, tuning the A to? So I would ask Dr. Horowitz that at a conference in LA. The next year he was there. Dr. Horowitz, you haven't answered my question yet. What note are you tuning? And the second year he said, well, I asked my engineers, we're tuning A to 444.
Okay.
Now, what's so interesting is that's higher than 440. So if 440 is bad because it's higher than 432, well, I know as a guitarist or a pianist, if you try to tune a piano to 444, you will definitely kill the piano. It'll just freak out. The soundboard will fracture. The strings will be going everywhere, and you could die because you could get impaled. But the tuner said, I'm not going near that. So that was the end of that. obviously there's realities for the 528. There's realities for many things,
Of
but in
course.
terms of music, it seems that the more music is at 432, and there were some rock people and rock bands and some other that were recording with this,
Hmm.
but it's not as big a thing yet. But on the internet and in YouTube, there's a lot of people. But there's a lot of people that they'll play an hour of a robot playing a couple of songs or whatever and say this is healing music. It's at 432, it's at 528 or whatever, and for many people it's unlistenable.
Well,
And
you said it so well, Stephen, before in our podcast here today, which is that if it's beautiful music at 440 hertz, then it's going to be beautiful music at 432 hertz. And I mean, we've all experienced, all of us I know have experienced amazing healing and just profound experiences with music that's absolutely at 440 because it's the standard tuning.
yeah,
Right?
yeah,
And so it doesn't take away from that at all. And for me, it's like, well, I feel I resonate with that frequency. I've been testing it for the last 9 years now, and it
wow,
it really feels profound for me. But that's me, and I say that to my audience when I'm performing. I'm like, hey, nothing against the 440 thing though, because ultimately, what I want for people is just to start looking at music as something more than entertainment, which was what exactly we're talking
exactly.
about.
And that's why my career has pissed off so many reviewers and critics, because I consciously chose not to focus on entertainment. Now, in concert, I learned, because my early concerts, I just sat there, closed my eyes, didn't pay attention to the noise, went into state. And when I started doing some of the things I picked up from Victor Borger, Liberace, it might be just one little thing, but playing an arpeggio and then off the end of the keyboard. I could have gone further, but there wasn't enough notes. You get the audience and you shift that energy, and then you can take them deeper. So there was that aspect. And from my days on the bandstand playing guitar and trumpet, I knew how to walk on stage and do some of the stuff that when I'm being a public speaker and a keynote speaker, I knew how to walk with a microphone and do things that would entrain the audience with my hands or whatever. They didn't know I was doing that, but I was the most. All the other speakers would pretty much stand by the podium, and I was wandering the stage and really engaging, and that made it more entraining. Uh, Even with the band, we resisted because we were a jazz rock band doing the steps. But every once in a while, just if I'm sitting in with a rock band or something else, as a trumpet player, if there's a sax player, we'll spontaneously go into the steps that a horn section would do because we all know them. But we do them for like a minute or two. People love it, and it's not because that was a tradition in the R&B world, and myself and some of my friends were usually the only white guys at the Harlem, the Apollo Theater in Harlem in New York, and got to see all those bands and learned a lot about entertainment and some of what goes on. And I'll tell you that many of the artists, and also gospel artists, admit, and some of them have spoken publicly, like Patti LaBelle, that they go into trance on stage, particularly gospel artists. And when they start hopping around, that's part of the signal that they transmit to the audience that I am now in an altered state and the spirit is coming through. They describe it a little differently, but the signs are there. And I remember when I first read Patti LaBelle talking about that, I knew it. I thought that's what was happening. And she was one of the first, to talk about, yeah, when we're doing some of that, we're having a good time on stage too.
Oh, and you can feel it. I mean, I love gospel, and there's some bands now that I really like who do gospel dance music, so it's just like that epic church gospel choir, but then with a thumping beat behind it. I mean, if that
Yeah.
doesn't get you going on a Sunday afternoon, I don't know what will.
Just a note, I think something was just on TV. It was either on, I think it was Stephen Colbert, but it might have been on Fallon, but I'm probably sure it was Stephen Colbert. The War and Treaty. They had which was a great kind of gospel good. They were doing kind of gospel rock with a horn section, couple of guitar players, which they didn't have the last time I saw them at the Grammys or something. What incredible stuff. And even going back to American Idol, when Fantasia was on, talking about entrainment, when she won, and she's singing, and then the screen opens and they have the gospel choir Well, what's happening when the whole gospel choir with their robes are doing the motion? They are visually entraining the audience. And I wrote in my little podcast, well, it was just a newsletter back then, 40 million Americans just when, how many people were watching? 20 million just went into trance and didn't know it, because that's what happens. You can't tell your body, do not go into trance when you have this happen. You can't tell your heartbeat, do not entrain to that rhythm. It happens naturally. It's a physiological function. And I'm there going, whoa, that's the first time that's ever been on mass, major level, public TV station, whatever his channel, CBS or whatever that channel was, that had never been that public before. And a lot of people didn't get it, but I wrote some things. And because some of my education, I'll just share this before we go, came from the book and written by Morton Marks, Marks, who studied trance induction and the fact that African religions were all trance-based religions. It came through the R&B tradition and goes into the current gospel tradition also. I was turned on to his work in 1973 by a ceremonial Afro-Cuban ritual drummer who said, if you are interested in this kind of thing, you need to check this out. He got me a copy of his manuscript. The book finally came out. It's available in different places. And Morton Marks, I said, if you're still alive, contact me. I had no idea that he would be, searching me on the internet or following something. He said, hi, I'm Morton Marks. I'm still alive. We need to talk. And that became that book opened my brain and my body and my soul up to the fact that this is not accidental. These people have orchestrated bodies and minds and brains and spirits for hundreds of years, and they know it works, but they don't talk about it scientifically with, well, this is a brainwave frequency. And so, but I remember being when the earliest, when it was still legal, a psychedelic trip where the guide would be doing the shamanic drumming. I'm there with a piece of paper writing down, okay, here's the rhythm he's playing, and here's the beat, and it was like, no, man, put that down, just get into. And then the mescaline kicked in, and the sound started swishing around. They go, we don't need to, it's not about the left brain, how many beats per second he's playing. It's about the experience. That was life-changing, and that was 1968. And then things became illegal, and now we do it naturally with sound.
Yeah, and some of those just got legalized again, like psilocybin. And I have it on my website where there's a ton of, finally they've been allowed to do research again with them. And what do they find with psychedelic assisted therapies is one of the quintessential parts of the therapy: music.
Yes. And part of the reason I did my most recent album called Music for Microdosing was because when I listened to the soundtracks that they were recommending, and not having a chance to do the research myself yet, because you have to have the right therapist to work with, I looked at the soundtracks, I go, Katy Perry, EDM? I don't want to be in an altered state listening to that.
I didn't know that.
I said, I better do my own album. So when I get a chance to do, that kind of research, I'll have something safe and uplifting to listen to. And I put the album out, and I understand it was a hit at the recent psychedelic conference in Denver in this past June. But it scared off a lot of other people. If you're not in that world, just when you see do you have to be stoned to listen to this music? No, the music will take you there by itself. But for marketing purposes, so I will be putting out a follow-up album that does not use the word microdosing. I won't be confusing people, but the music will get you into the altered state. And we're allowed to talk about that because this is science.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is. And it's reshaping therapy right now for us. I mean, I'm so grateful for all that. Stephen, I could talk to you for weeks on end, clearly. And I'm absolutely adoring our conversation here. But I think, I know we need to wrap it up here. I would love to get your final thoughts before we tell people about where they can reach you and all that.
Great.
What are your final thoughts on right now? Currently, we're recording this at the beginning of 2026. and the world is, well, the world right now. It's a little chaotic, to say the very least. But in all this chaos, I still have a sense of hope for us. And I was curious what you sense, just in an overall viewpoint, that when you look at things right now, what do you think people need to hear, not just musically, but also just from your words of wisdom? What are we moving into, do you think, as a species? Where are we headed? And any words of wisdom for our audience?
Well, there's two things happening at the same time. There's more negative stuff, and more people are awakening. Uh, I'm on a lot of different mail lists. I read things from the great spiritual leader and teacher Marianne Williamson, who has such an optimistic aspect, optimistic outlook on what's going on. But and I just saw something on CNN last night where regular people who have not been conscious in many ways are saying, this is so bad. I mean, the people who have been shot, their karma, like George Floyd, are awakening people that this is so wrong that people who've never paid attention before are going, we have to turn this around. And that's where my hope is, that suddenly people who have not been at the protest, and I can't imagine being out there in 0-degree weather and doing all that. I couldn't do that. But I will, certainly I support, but the fact that so many people are, and I think that gives us hope, because there's obviously, as we saw with the election last year, the Project 2025, there are so many people who have been planning to make things so much worse for us. And, without going into details, I think as more people awaken, and in our country, we'll know with the elections at the end of this year, whether there's enough of those who go, things have gotten so much worse, we need to turn this around. And it's not going to be the small group of protesters or demonstrators. It's going to be all those people who voted, or a lot of the people who voted for Trump, and a lot of people who never voted at all say, I need to get off my ass. I need to be part of the solution, rather than just saying, oh, I'm too spiritual, or I can't get involved. We all know friends who said, I can't get involved, or I'm not into. If you're living on the planet, you're involved. Your vibrational being is impacted by all that's going on, whether you're aware of it or not. It's like a lead blanket on your head in terms of meditation, that it'll be better for all of us when we make it better for all of us. So that's how I stay positive, and it's why I continue to put out music, and will continue to talk about what we could do for ourselves to keep ourselves in tune, to raise our own consciousness, and how we could use sound and music to raise our consciousness, because the key phrase there is, what we feed the field, the electromagnetic field, matters. And we feed the field because, as I mentioned before, when every atom, molecule, cell, and gland radiates, when we radiate frequencies of peace and well-being and mindfulness, that the planet appreciates it. People who we've never met pick up on some of that. Rupert Sheldrake's book tells us how people are affected, even if they're not aware of being affected. And that's why I choose to be part of that optimistic aspect, and don't give up all hope, because if we do that, we're definitely going to go down the wrong path, and we may not be having this conversation in a couple of years. So that's how I stay positive and keep doing what I do.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I 1000% feel you on that, and I know our audience definitely can resonate with that as well. So, thank you, and thank you for all the work that you do. It is so important, and it is an amazing way to impact people. I think that's been something in my intuition my whole life with music, is that what a great vehicle we have as musicians to be able to positively affect the planet in such a literal vibrational wave kind of way, where it literally will ripple out and shift the consciousness of people, so that we can help ourselves and each other.
Exactly. And that's what musicians were doing in ancient Greece and Egypt and so many other cultures, when I was a hotshot jazz trumpet player and I played a great solo, and people said, "Man, that was a great solo. It was such a trip. I went to such great places." No one ever said, "Man, that was so healing. You healed, I listened to your album and I feel healed." And then they have medical things that show that they were healed. No one ever said that from my trumpet playing and guitar playing or from, typically jazz. But that's the shift. And beyond entertainment, there's enlightenment, there's entrainment. Beyond entertainment, and I have articles, beyond entertainment, there is entrainment. And
Mm,
that's where we're going.
I love it. So for our audience, Stephen, can you tell them where they can get in touch with you, where they can see your work? Of course, as our audience knows, you can see all of Stephen Halpern's beautiful music and experience it on all of your streaming platforms, of course. But where can they get in contact with you? And do you have anything this year coming up you want to tell us about?
Well, yes. So the first answer is my new website is still in beta testing, but it's already up. Stephen Halpern Music, and there's a little uh, choice up at the top, former website, so you can see what it's looked like for the last 10 years, where a lot of my articles that still haven't been transferred are there. All my albums are there. Some albums that are not streaming yet, but you could also read the liner notes. I have no idea how many people read liner notes, but I spend so much time writing them to inform and educate my audience. But the new website is much more contemporary, and that will be more of what I'm working with this year. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/Stephen Halpern Music. And there are menus that you could look at my workshops, my concert footage, and videos with great visuals for Deep Alpha, Deep Theta, so many albums, the Pyramid album inside the Great Pyramid, albums that were the early trance music like Here to Eternity and Ancient Echoes, where you will see a mystical dancer with a channeled voice that was coming through during the recording of the album that became Ancient Echoes with Georgia Kelly on harp, and a dancer that I met, that when we met in LA, we recognized that we shared a past life together, and we wound up doing some concerts together based around our Egyptian connections. So that's on some of the videos, and the next album will be one that again relates to the positive aspects of higher consciousness and balancing the brain, without mentioning some of the other plant medicine and that whole context, uh, as well as the next album that's on its way out now is called Om Zone 432 Hertz, which features my voice chanting Sylvia Nakache, a great chant master, and some other people who it's. I looked at it originally as spiritual karaoke. Chanting alone at home is kind of boring. I'm sitting up on my meditation pillow. In a yoga class, at the end of class, we chant Om. But I wanted some chanters, so I said I might as well, you know, create my own soundtrack. And that's how that album began 25 years ago. And it's what I would do in concert and have the audience own and get people to use their voice a little bit as well. And, it's not a tricky mantra. It's a one syllable mantra. You don't have to memorize a whole bunch of words. So we'll be doing more work with that this year also. And you can find all these on those two main channels. And of course, most of my music is streaming, but I had to transition to a new digital distributor, so not everything is back up online yet, but and streaming, but most will be. And if you can't find it online, you might find some on YouTube, and you can find everything always on my website.
100%. Thank you, Stephen. And I was just perusing it before our recording today. And for our audience, you can also purchase individual tracks of Stephen's as well on his website. So it's just a fantastic way to dive more into his work. I look forward to adding even more of your albums to my Spotify playlists. And of course, I'll be supporting you on the website too.
One more thing, if I just add,
Please.
I am part of a small group that will be marketing very soon my music combined with quantum scalar frequencies.
Oh,
And
wow.
there'll be a link on my website. But this more than 432 is one of the amazing new developments. There's a number of sites that are working with now the light system, energy enhancement system, but they don't have the music, and
Mhm.
they don't have the right music. The difference, I've listened to one of the demos of some of my music with the scale of frequencies and without. I got to tell you, I could feel the difference. You can feel the difference, and that will be available soon. And you could access that from the new website, from the old website, and that's something to be looking for because it's a quantum leap involving new technology that is again beyond entertainment.
Mhm.
And the funny thing is, the streaming site said, "Well, you mentioned this other person. Is she a vocalist? What does she sing? What are the words? No, she radiates frequencies. She's not a vocalist. She's not an artist. Or so it's funny because the uh, the streaming world, if you're not a musician or you're not an instrument, they have no place to put you. It's inaudible frequency, subliminal affirmations. They don't know what those are, so there's nowhere to talk about it. But on my website, you'll be able to find out everything.
I love it. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Stephen. It was an absolute joy and a pleasure. And I know for myself and our audience, just thank you for everything you've done and continue to do for us. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Bye bye, everybody.
All right. You take care now. Wow, what an episode. I am so grateful to have had Stephen on today. As of course, you lovely people watching and listening know, my musical nerd side was very, very tickled today in this conversation. That was so fascinating. I got a lot of things I got to think about now and be incorporating into my music. So thank you, Stephen, very much. For our beautiful audience watching and listening, of course, you can find all of Stephen's information in the show notes below. So don't have to worry about that. And be sure to follow up with him. Listen to his music. Check it out. It is incredibly soothing and relaxing. I've been meditating to it for years. In fact, I think after this episode, I'm going to take a nice bath and go through his chakra series, and just have a nice retune. So check it out. Steven's fantastic, beautiful soul. Thank you for being on the show. And as always, kind of appropriate, I guess, for today's show, that our sponsor, which is the Therapeutic Music Library, that's going to be in the show notes below. If you are a practitioner or a therapist or someone wanting to use therapeutic music in your practice so that you have the license and everything's all good to go professionally, that's a great resource for you to check out. As well as if you want to join us to our sacred site tour this year, which is in Egypt. We just talked about the Great Pyramid, of course, and the King's Chamber. Well, we'll have private access to that where we can chant and we can do some really incredible sound activations, as Stephen also talked about the oming inside there, which I was fortunate enough to do back in 2019. Changed my life, and I know it'll change yours for the better as well. If you want to come join us, all in the show notes below, check it out. As for that, that is concluding our episode today. Thank you so much, everybody, for tuning in to this episode of Ancient Mysteries on Earth. Sending you so much love, and we will see you in the next episode. Until next time.